everybody watching. I wanted to introduce Mary Chobanian. She is a former admissions rater at Harvard Law School, at Barnard College, at Dickinson College, so long line of history working in admissions. And now she's a full-time college counselor with Ingenius Prep. So we're super lucky to have you. And yeah, if you just want to start off by telling us a little bit about your career path and how you ended up where you are.
Sure. Thanks so much, Casey. So yes, I'm Mary Chobanian. I'm a senior counselor at Ingenius Prep. I started in secondary education, actually, as a master's student who taught in public high schools outside Philadelphia. I became passionate about education, specifically equitable access to quality education through that experience. But I moved pretty quickly into undergraduate admissions for the opportunity to explore education outside the classroom. I was involved in education policy, strategic planning and enrollment management, admissions volunteer programs and event coordination, transfer admissions, partnerships with nonprofits, community-based organizations, and actually community colleges as well, programs in support of college access for minoritized and underprivileged students, for example, Native American students, documented and undocumented students. I also worked a lot with international students. So as Casey mentioned, I worked previously at Dickinson College and with Barnard College and actually UC San Diego as well. The opportunity to work at Harvard Law School, or HLS, resulted from my enrollment in a graduate program at Harvard Graduate School of Education. So I was an intern at HLS who not only reviewed applications, and hundreds of them, but I also had the ability to interview candidates, attend meetings, and support on-campus programs during my time. I also maintain my relationships with the HLS JD admissions staff to this day. So that's a nice plus. But after my experience with secondary education and undergraduate admissions, law school admissions, alumni relations and fundraising, learning experience design, graduate level educational research. So I've been all over education. I actually elected to transfer permanently to the other side of the desk, where the relationships with students for me felt more fulfilling, since they're authentic and driven by student passion and perseverance. And aligning with Ingenius Prep's mission, I work to support student access and success by empowering students. And that's college, high school students, actually middle school students, high school students, and postgraduates preparing for graduate school, including law school. And so I thankfully no longer play gatekeeper at a selective institution and instead open doors for students.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
And it's really cool to hear about your history with education policy. I studied public policy in college, so super policy wonk. So that's really cool to hear that we have that shared background. And if we had another hour, I'd want to ask you all about those questions as well. But I guess I'll stick to the law school thing for this time around. But yeah, so just I kind of like to start these off with a somewhat fun question. So if you had to pick a few words or perhaps a phrase to describe your admissions philosophy, either when you were a reader or now as, like you said, you're opening doors for students, what would that be?
Sure. Certainly as an admissions officer, one thing I want to highlight is holistic review. I'm not sure, and I feel pretty comfortable to say that a lot of pre-law students are familiar with hearing that, particularly because it's something that's popular amongst colleges, but is also utilized in graduate school admissions, including law admissions. So holistic review is, again, this idea that an application is read cover to cover multiple times. Understanding that a student is more than just a GPA and an LSAT score. And that's to say, even from the perspective of HLS, an elite law school. So essays, research, professorial and professional relationships, experiences, background, interests, aspirations, and more really, go insofar as to, define the applicant beyond just a number. I also just want to mention as well, an additional phrase that I would say guides not only my admissions philosophy, but those of my colleagues oftentimes is educational access and student success. So, recognizing that every capable student deserves access to quality law education, including a spot at HLS. The questions being, can the student thrive on the HLS campus and succeed post-graduation? Can HLS effectively support this applicant? In other words, what does the student need to flourish and how can HLS support them?
Yeah, that I think the holistic approach, and I know I'll ask you a few questions about how students can kind of approach that whole to make sure they're covering all different parts of that in their application. I'll ask you about that a little later, but that's definitely really important and great to hear that, it's not just your LSAT score, your GPA, it's all of these things combined and really trying to create that right fit. So thank you for sharing that. And kind of going off of that, I know from your bio and kind of the work that you've done, something that you seem very dedicated to and passionate about is equity in education. And I know in 2020 and 2021 with the social uprisings, with the police brutality, lots of things coming to the surface that have been systemic inequities for a long time. So I just wanted to ask you, what role do you think law school admissions plays in addressing these racial inequities, socioeconomic inequities in the US?
Right. It's a difficult question to answer. And obviously, of course, an extremely important one, very relevant, but even beyond what's been happening and everything, this is a subject that goes beyond just, the recent events, of course. Law admissions process is, inherently inequitable in the sense that for example, Casey, a 2015 study by the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that law was the least racially diverse profession in the United States and remains among the top today. Additionally, in 2020, just last year, the American Bar Association reported that 86% of all lawyers in the US were non-Hispanic whites, Black lawyers making up only 5% of all lawyers in the United States. So we definitely have an issue for sure, but it goes beyond just admissions, just getting into the school. Part of it is the cost of effective test preparation for the LSAT, and even for some law schools, GREs as well. That those that accept them, I know HLS does. Submitting applications, the cost of submission is too high for many students. First generation students, for example, are also unfamiliar with the ins and outs of the admissions process, and including key actors who can support their efforts to prepare and apply, to prepare for and apply to law school. Challenges that also come inherently with a rolling admissions process. When do I apply? Is it better to apply early or can I apply later? What are the pros and cons? And so a lot of students don't have access to that knowledge. I know that there's a lot of nonprofit organizations. I've actually connected with a few, as well as I recognize that some law schools are attempting to level the playing field and develop an equitable pipeline programs to law school. And this goes insofar as, so far as high school even, but efforts still have not extended to everyone and everywhere. That being said, internationally, for example, law firms, for example, benefit greatly from diversity, equity, inclusion, and they're a key stakeholder in providing funding for these and access to these programs. But amongst all the players in law school access, I'd say JD Admissions plays a significant role in moving the needle and confronting racial and socioeconomic inequities in the United States.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that research. And like you said, this is such a systemic problem and something that law school admissions, I think, is a part of. And now going through the process myself, like I'm realizing, like you said, like how many different things that, it's not just, oh, you take the LSAT, connecting with people and filling out the applications and all of those questions that you said. So I definitely agree, like there needs to be solutions and innovations and changes. But thank you for going into that. And then kind of going on, the next few questions I'll be asking you, I just wanted to talk about your work experience, specifically at Harvard Law School and beyond that. And so just kind of to get into it a little bit, what is the general process? I know you touched a little bit that it's not just one person reading an application, but what does it actually look like after you send your application into a law school?
Sure, sure. And I've actually, kept up to date, as I mentioned earlier, kept in touch and kept up to date with at least the HLS admissions process or the review process, because I've kept in touch with some of the senior staff in their office. So I know that this is not outdated, if you will. But for example, Harvard Law School's JD admissions team takes a very traditional approach to reviewing applications. Review takes quite a long time since applications are read holistically, as I mentioned previously, but they're read cover to cover multiple times. Each application submitted to HLS is reviewed at least twice before a decision is confirmed. And admissions officers will often conduct first reads of applications, recommend decisions, and then send them along to admissions officers conducting second reads. From there, additional reviews may take place as needed, in the case that questions are brought up or flags are made, etc. But following second reads, the interview selection committee, so admissions officers, a committee of admissions officers will review applications recommended for admission and extend invitations to applicants for interviews. So there are some schools that offer interviews to everyone. There are some that don't offer interviews, but only to a select group or might be random. In this case, HLS has a very systematic approach and methodical approach to their interview process. So that's saying on this side of the desk, when I have a student who's applied to HLS who gets an interview invitation, I can let them know that that's a really great opportunity for them. If interviews are successful, then Harvard Law School faculty will actually step in and review the selection of applications and offer their feedback to the final group or on the final group of applications recommended for admission. Finally, the admissions committee comes together and they review as a full committee. Each application is presented and discussions ensue. And I know that HLS also has different decision release days. So it is kind of an ongoing rolling process, but that's the general approach that they take. Additionally, it's very thorough. The application review process is very intensive and it involves a lot of different players, not just inside the admissions office, but certainly outside as well. And there are plenty of checks and balances in the process as well to ensure that no mistakes are made.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that process. I think, a lot of people, I've heard a lot of things about, what are the timelines of these things? Should I be worried? Or it often seems like you submit your application and then it goes into a black box. So just like understanding that process a little more, I'm sure will be really helpful for a lot of prospective students. And then kind of going off of that, I'm curious to know, when you were reading applications or even now, what have been some applications that really stood out to you? Or more generally, what makes an application stand out to you?
Sure. Responding to the latter part of that question, kind of the broad aspects, I can provide some little examples of some outstanding applications. But I think taking that step back is really important too. I don't want students comparing themselves to previous applicants, also because the examples I chose also, not all of them were admitted, not all of them enrolled, etc. But one piece being authenticity. That's really important. So this strong sense of self and understanding of, an applicant's strong sense of self and an understanding of who they are is really, really important. That they're pursuing activities and opportunities that connect closely to their passions and their values. Most applicants that actually really stood out to me were not law fanatics. They weren't kind of sitting amongst the dusty tomes, studying law all of their life. There was one who really fascinated me, who actually has a background in theology and had previously attended divinity school. So their kind of philosophical perspective in their personal statement really, drew me in, and I was intellectually really engaged in their writing. Another was an international applicant who actually had served in their country's military. out of obligation. And they wrote about how, their experience completely changed their perspective on domestic social issues. So that was really, fascinating as well, especially because, being a domestic reader, being someone from the United States, it was really fascinating to read through a, very different foreign lens. Another was someone with a multilinguistic background who had been involved in grassroots social movements in the Middle East. So it was more like by happenstance, they had found themselves taking advantage of different opportunities that came along, and they even surprised themselves, kind of realizing, wow, I realize I need to get a law degree in order to pursue what I want to pursue, but it wasn't always something that I, had thought I needed. Another aspect I would highlight is, that element of passion. I think I've kind of highlighted it already, but to emphasize it, I'd say, being able to identify a cause, a topic, an academic subject, an activity, something that that the applicant, that they are enamored with and has driven them to pursue a law degree. Recognizing it's not so much, the law degree, the JD is their kind of end goal, but rather I need this law degree to change the world. I need to do this. I need to get this so that I can do what I want and pursue what I love. That level of passion is very evident in some awesome, outstanding applications. I also want to highlight, of course, critical thinkers, problem solvers. These are critical analysts, people who, the outstanding applicants, kind of being able to creatively and innovatively think and, strategically evaluate different circumstances. They're well-read with good research skills. I can certainly tell you that HLS really looks for those types of skills. But in addition, those types of applications that actually force me to think, almost to slow down in my reading, make me think twice about the applicant. Lastly, I'll mention kind of just a basic but important logistical piece, which is, applications that really stand out to me also have a clear connection to why law. Just admissions officers were sitting there thinking the entire time, why, okay, this student is awesome, the student is incredible, they're extraordinary, but why law? These standout applicants can answer this question succinctly, effectively, and with a clear motivation to use their degree to improve society.
Yeah, thank you for all of those different examples. I know I want to read some of those stories too. They sound like incredible and really inspiring. And it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, it's not only that personal story and the why law, but the JD is not an end in itself, but an end to another goal, and just one step along their ideas for what they want to do, how they want to change the world. So that's really cool to hear. It's not just one tract that you can really come to HLS with lots of different backgrounds and perspectives. So thank you for sharing all those stories with me. Great. So you've kind of answered this one, but so when reading applications, actually, yeah, since we have a limited amount of time, I was going to ask you the specific qualities that Harvard Law School looks for when they're looking for applications. So I know you just kind of answered that to a large extent, but is there anything else you would want to add to that question?
It's great, yes, I kind of already answered it, but I would actually, thinking specifically, Casey, to HLS, and I think a lot of top law schools in general, two key characteristics or qualities that students should really be thinking about in preparation for law school and, while putting together those law applications is firstly a skill in self-reflection. So, again, that question of why law school now also is a question that comes up a lot. Like, why now? Why can't it be later? And so this really, it's that strong sense of self-awareness, that ability to reflect on your values, your, why you're doing what you're doing, why you love what you love, etc. So recognizing that each applicant has an authentic path toward law, and applicants have to demonstrate an ownership of that path. Not an embarrassment or a shyness or levels of uncertainty, but really being able to own their sense of self is really important. I'd also just, again, logistically like to share, and I think this is important to add, is, a demonstration of strong writing skills. That is definitely something that HLS highlights very much. They take seriously, the experience that students have had in doing any level of, writing or having written or are currently writing any theses or dissertations, academic research, whether in undergraduate or graduate school. That writing ability, certainly beyond, research and dissertations or theses, et cetera, big research papers, can go beyond and into, kind of a demonstration of transcript or the personal statement, the optional or supplemental essays, et cetera, testing can all reflect levels of strong writing skills. But it's really, really important. And letters of recommendation, having a professor, for example, be able to speak to your writing skills. Writing skills are important, that HLS is looking for them. It's important for a current law student. So recognizing that this student already comes well equipped to, achieve at that high level, to write academically at a high level is really important. So something that HLS will look for in an application.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly important. And I'll have to go back. I had a professor in college who said the same exact thing almost. He was like, my students come back to me and they always say, like, thank you for teaching me how to write. He's like, that's the one skill you'll need, whatever job you're in, whatever you're doing. So I'll have to go back and thank Dr. Denemark for telling me to improve my writing skills.
Really important.
Yeah, that's great. And then kind of switching gears a little bit, but still talking about HLS. Obviously, Harvard Law School is one of the top programs in the country, incredible opportunities and resources and faculty to work with. What would you say to students who maybe are nervous about applying or don't think that Harvard Law School is an option for them despite being qualified? What would you say as advice for them?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And, certainly being on this side of the desk as a counselor is something I confront and work with, these students often. And I can relate to it personally, to the sentiment, because my decision to apply to a top education school in the United States, I hadn't initially, I shied away from applying to elite schools until finally I had enough kind of gall to do it for graduate school. And that included Harvard and Penn, for example. So I can relate to it in some circumstance. But the biggest thing here, Casey, of course, is, you never, the thing is, you never know unless you try, right? And I'm a huge fan of cliches, but it's, that's really important to remind yourself that you can't be rejected if you never apply. You can't be admitted if you never apply. You won't know the answer to that. And imposter syndrome, which is, kind of what we're bouncing around, or we're walking around, this sense of feeling inadequate is real, and it is extremely discouraging. And, imposter syndrome, which is, I'll loosely define it as, doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud, like you don't belong, like you shouldn't be applying to HLS. Even if, every one of your peers, your mentors can tell you, and you can recognize that you are qualified. Your test scores, for example, demonstrate that you're qualified. Is a sentiment often, of course, felt by first-gen college and law students, as well as individuals from underrepresented and underprivileged backgrounds. I think it's important to mention that. But I would say, speak with current students and or alumni about their experiences, especially if their background and or their experiences mirror your own. So for example, HLS JD admissions team, they can help you help put you in touch with students and alumni so that you can converse with them. And oftentimes that level of kind of communication with a student especially, but sometimes even with alumni, you feel the pressure's off. Asking them, as a student who is sharing this level of experience with their, admissions process, their time at HLS, you can feel a sense of connection with that individual, and then feel a stronger sense of comfort in their story that hopefully in many ways can empower you. I also can just simply attest to the fact that the HLS admissions team is absolutely wonderful. So I would encourage students who are looking at HLS to really reach out to them. They're absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, I also agree with the sentiment. Like you can't get rejected, you can't get accepted unless you try. So I think that's a really We often forget that, but at the end of the day, it's very true. And kind of just a follow up from that,
Mhm.
do you have any advice for students as they approach maybe former students or current students, just on how to connect with them and how to learn from their experiences?
Sure. I mean, part of it is the easiest approach is, recognizing whether or not the admissions office actually, or, again, this doesn't have to be specific to HLS, but whether the law admissions office already has student ambassadors or has alumni that they can recommend. That kind of that level of connection with the admissions office lets you know that this is going to be an alum or a student that feels comfortable sharing their story, feels comfortable having a conversation with a prospective student. We'll give you the time, for example. Sometimes it can feel a little uncomfortable if you blindly are connecting with an HLS or a law alumni or a law student, because they might be super busy. They might not want to share their story. They might not be able to share their story in some cases. They might not be comfortable sharing it. But in the case that there is a connection with the admissions office, or that the admissions office can recommend someone, or again, it might be a friend or even a friend of a friend. I've had that case, working on as a counselor, where I've had students reach out, friend of a friend or parent of a friend, kind of connection.
Hmm.
Those types of, kind of informal
Hmm.
relationships can make the anxiety and the stress that can come with, oh gosh, this is someone who is in this law school that I want to go to. Are they going to report back to admissions? Is this going to go on my file, etc. Making sure that you can have a genuine and authentic conversation with a current student or an alum, and doing that through, for example, through admissions can be good, as well as any sort of informal connections can be comforting as well.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing your own personal experiences, Mary. I appreciate that as well with your own educational journey. And I think I really seen that too, putting kind of a face to the process. It's not just like we said, like you're not just sending your application off and it's not being read by computers or anything. Like these are real people at the other line. And they have their own stories and experiences too. So I think that's really great advice. So thank you for sharing that. Um, and then one other question before we kind of move on to some general law school admissions questions is what advice would you give to students who may not have gone to a top undergraduate program or may have maybe some unconventional experiences or may for example, had to work and didn't have the opportunity to do internships? What would you say to those students as they apply to top law programs?
Right. And of course, keeping in mind, Casey, in response to this question, that this is coming from my HLS background. So I can't speak to every and any, other type of top law school, but I feel comfortable sharing that there's a significant number of HLS applicants and, therefore admitted students who did not graduate from top undergraduate programs, and countless applicants and admitted students have very unconventional experiences. I think, one thing I recognize working with HLS admissions is they really love a student's authentic story. So being upfront and honest about, your path, and again, owning that path to the law degree is, honestly could be your greatest asset. HLS prefers students with work experience. It's a greater challenge. You're up against a greater challenge if you have just graduated from college. And HLS is pretty honest and open about that. They prefer students that have some work experience, and that is students who've taken time off, after college to pursue their passion through work, through employment, through research, through military experience, through volunteer work, etc., and so forth. It's really about individuals who are pursuing these passions, and demonstrating that they have experience in these real world issues, these passions that they have, etc. So honestly, a unique experience will help you stand out, among other applicants. So coming from an not top undergraduate program, that's it's not disregarded by HLS, and those unconventional life experiences, if anything, are just, they can be a real asset again to your application, help you stand out.
Yeah, and that actually leads really well into my next question, which we've kind of discussed a little bit at the beginning of this interview, but what role do you think storytelling plays in someone's personal statement and other essays, diversity statements, and kind of what tips or suggestions do you have for crafting that authentic story that someone wants to tell?
Sure. It's a great question. And I love that you use the word storytelling. As I share with my prospective law students, your application must be three things. It's cohesive, coherent, and compelling. Hopefully that can be easily remembered, but it's something I share a lot. The narrative or story should be authentic, and I know I've used that word more than once in this interview. But authenticity is key, really. But it should be authentic as it weaves together your experiences, your values, your qualifications, your passions, and your aspirations. A personal statement and supplemental essays should highlight an important piece of your story, not your whole life experience, but a piece of your story, a key component, but should also explicitly address, the questions of why law now. Sometimes that gets double underlined in committee, why law now? Why does the student have to go to law school now? And then, of course, why X law school? That's really important as well to a number of top law schools. Before you begin drafting a personal statement, and I say this also as, simply as an educator, be sure you self-reflect before you sit down and write, before you decide on your topic, before you even honestly look at any prompts. Ask yourself questions about who you are and why you are that way. What values do you uphold and why? What are you passionate about and why? Why are you interested in pursuing a law degree? And what impact will it have on achieving your goals? Those why questions I ask my students all the time. So really important that you do that level of self-reflection. Also be prepared, as we know, certainly as pre-law or law applicants, be prepared to write several drafts and perhaps even start from scratch a few times. I've had some of my own students, kind of realize, I hate this essay. And it's like, I think you can't really go anywhere but all the way back in the beginning. And it can be really frustrating, but that's part of the writing process. So being open to that and being okay with that really helps you, honestly, discover more about yourself and recognize, how can I really write the best personal statement, for example, or writing written supplemental essay. Or diversity statement, for example. Find a trustworthy peer, a mentor, a professor, or a counselor who can help with the brainstorming, as well as editing processes. I say this inevitably as an educator, but also as a law admissions counselor, that having another set of eyes can be really eye-opening. They'll notice things that maybe you could never have noticed before. And so some feedback that you can get from, again, trusted individuals is really important. And I say trusted because you don't want someone who's going to rip your essay apart and kind of make it their own. You want to make sure that this is going to be someone who recognizes the impact of this essay, right, or these essays. All of this means that you need to begin writing early. You need to begin the process early. So procrastination is not your friend. And if anything, try to trick your mind. Tell yourself that in order to kind of ease the anxiety that comes with putting together applications and submitting applications, that you can avoid that by, again, beginning this process early. So leave yourself adequate time for drafting and revising.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm sure this video will be posted soon. So for those of us who may be applying next cycle or even a few cycles from now, I think great advice to hear at this point in now. So start reflecting now is what I'm hearing, and thinking about how to craft those essays well ahead of time. That is absolutely great advice. And you've also talked about this kind of the cohesiveness of an application, since there's so many different parts. It's not just your LSAT, it's not just your GPA, it's all of these different things to make you an applicant. And so I was kind of wondering, how do you take all of these different aspects and create a compelling application overall? I know some students may, like you said, try to put everything in a personal statement or think that they have to. So how do you kind of take all those different aspects and make a compelling story?
Sure, sure. It's really important keeping in mind that the entire application tells a story. So, if you are really focused in, you're narrowed in on that essay as like, this is going to be like who I am, my story, inevitably the rest of the application will still play a part, even if you are focusing on that one thing. So regardless, just be mindful that the broad perspective is essential, that you have to take that step back. Maybe sometimes it requires, again, a trusted peer, a mentor, a professor, etc., someone who can help you in taking that step back. But it's inevitable because as an admissions reader, as an admissions officer, we are reading the entire application, cover to cover multiple times. And so that essay is just one component. The diversity statement is just one component. It's actually usually at the end of the application. So it's really important that there's a recognition that it's multiple parts that tell the whole story. And the key to combining the different aspects of an application, as well as combining the various facets of your personality, is by establishing, for example, an application persona. I'll say application persona because the term is used actually by Ingenius Prep. However, I've also heard it referred to as a personal narrative. And again, these are successful applications. So the application persona is not a secret to success. It's not like I'm revealing something here, but it's actually, it's most certainly a key to creating a cohesive, coherent, and compelling application. The application persona is kind of like a brand. It should be, sincere, distinctive, memorable. You want to be honest about yourself, to stand out amongst other applicants, and for admissions to easily and excitedly recall your story. So the persona should only be like a phrase or two. So keep it concise. And again, that plays into making sure that all components of the application kind of lead and connect to that persona, and also that it's memorable, that the admissions officer after reading can be like, okay, so-and-so is this. So examples, I think sometimes application persona or personal narratives, it's kind of like, whoa, she's going to give us a secret. She's going to give us, tell us the phrase is for every applicant. That's kind of the important piece there. But examples include, like cross-cultural legal communicator for the voiceless. That was one that I've had a student use. Environmental warrior, hoping to change hearts, minds, and policies through legal methods. So again, it's a combination. It's something that kind of highlights different facets of who you are and can help you. It's not something that you say outright in an essay, but can help you as the applicant make those connections between all those disparate aspects of the application and all those connections amongst those various facets of your personality.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, Mary, because even as you said that, I was starting to understand how the different parts could kind of fit under that like theme or umbrella, if you will, and kind of just have that as a reminder, like, why am I doing this again? Oh, right, like this is who I am, this is why I'm going.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. It's funny, like the secretness, and you're like, no, this is just it's right here, everybody can do this. It's just finding your own voice, it sounds like. And then kind of going off of that in a little bit of a different direction, but I know a lot of law schools pride themselves and want to encourage public service. I know personally, I want to pursue labor and employment law. And so what advice would you have for students who want to go into public service, but are nervous or worried about accruing a lot of debt while in law school?
Yeah, that's a serious concern, of course. And I've had that conversation a lot with a lot of students. And if you want to pursue a career in public service, honestly, props to you. That's phenomenal. The public is deeply grateful, and I'm deeply grateful as an extension. So, if you make this decision before or prior to enrolling in law school, then do your research on financial assistance in tandem with research on law schools. It can be really hard when you've already made that list of schools and then you're thinking about financial assistance, because it might not match up in regards to scholarship opportunities, financial aid packaging and how they package, alumni outcomes, for example, what alumni do or graduates do in terms of public service, where they are and how they might be able to support you, and what advice they could give you as well as a postgraduate. So it's really important that you do that work, if you can, to do it in tandem so that they kind of inform one another, rather than picking these schools that might not have great financial assistance or scholarship opportunities, for example. Regardless, there are organizations actually, including, and this is thinking domestically, but there are organizations, including state bar associations, that have established or are currently establishing programs to support student loan assistance for public service. So it is a recognition amongst professionals, amongst law professionals, that this is really important, to continue this endeavor and this pursuit toward public service. So it's imperative that you explore these types of options and opportunities. And again, resources being, as much as you want to connect with admissions or JD admissions, connect with their financial office, connect with, current students, or I would say recent graduates, more so than the later graduates. They can really provide you with honesty and frankness in their experience. But I would also say be upfront with the law school administrators. If finance is an extremely important aspect to your education, be honest and upfront, and don't shy away from asking those questions. I say that partially because out of personal experience, it can be hard to talk about, how can you fund me? How can you help me? How can I make this affordable? But recognizing that you're within every right to ask those questions, especially when they're challenging and they feel very personal, to advocate for yourself. And for your future, and honestly, in many ways, for the future clients with whom you work, recognizing that you can successfully enter into public service law and do it without an overly significant financial burden.
Yeah, and apologies if my video ever freezes. I've been getting the unstable internet connection, but thank you so much for explaining that. I think it's really important what you said, to acknowledge that you have to advocate for yourself and that these are conversations you can have with law schools, and thinking about that ahead of time, I think is really great advice, especially for people who are thinking about law school down the line. So huge question. So thank you for going into that a little bit. I appreciate that. And then we've been talking a lot about, the great parts of an application, what applications have stood out to you. Kind of on the flip side of that, what are some red flags that you've seen? And if so, which red flags should applicants potentially be aware of?
Sure. So this one might sound a little obvious, but it's really important, especially, and again, from my own personal experience of counseling law students, but also being even on admissions, on the admission side, is just to watch your mistakes. So be sure to edit your essays and review your application. And I really say, really watch your application. I don't know, I can't tell you how many times I've seen misspellings. And for certain, you don't know who's going to be reading your application. For certain people, it can be like, whoa, what's wrong with this? They keep misspelling this word, or, they totally didn't review their application because this is a misspelling or a mistake here. So just make sure that you're doing that review. It might mean, if you've been looking at that application, those essays for ages, you might need someone to just look it over briefly to catch any of those types of mistakes. But this also includes mistyping a law school's name or referring to another school in your application. I can say that I saw it more often in undergraduate applications, but I've seen it in law applications, and it can be really though it's no secret that you might be applying, if you're applying to HLS, you might be applying to Stanford and Yale, etc. But we've got our rivalries, and we want to know that you're committed to HLS. So seeing those names, it can be a little bit of a turnoff. Nothing too serious. I would say more seriously is something like inauthenticity. I know I've been emphasizing that word, but I want to double underline it here, highlight it. Just to share, because admissions officers are clever and are generally experts in judging people's characters and capabilities. So if you write about pursuing a career in civil liberties law, for example, but have a resume that reflects experience exclusively in the corporate sector, the admissions committee, they might think that you're trying to tell them what they want to hear. But maybe, this is you're trying to be honest. You really do want to, pursue civil liberties law. So if that's the case, make sure that, in the case that you have limited experience in it, be sure to address it honestly. Be upfront about it, but address it honestly in your essay and or an addendum. And a recommender can even, speak to such a change of heart. But it's really important to be upfront about those things. The other is, honestly, and I've seen this a few times, is making excuses. So, or not addressing what is a pretty obvious gap. Or issue on an application. For example, if there's a noticeable drop in your academic performance, you have a gap in your education, whatever the situation might be, just be forthright. Unexpected things happen in our lives, many of which, are often outside of our control. So therefore, it's important that you address those gaps or concerns honestly in your application. If you think, oh, maybe they're not going to notice that, truth is we're going to notice it. And also, admissions officers are human. As you mentioned earlier, Casey, it's not a robot. It's not a computer reading these applications. Seriously, they're humans. So we also, can empathize with a lot of those challenges, and we're familiar with them as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said about addressing kind of the differences between what your resume says and your future applications, that's actually a question that I had that you addressed, which is, it seems to be just acknowledge that, maybe have someone else back that up with what your plans are for the future. So I think that's a really good piece of advice for someone to have. So thank you for sharing that, Mary.
Absolutely.
Great. So just to switch gears a little bit to talk about this year's cycle, and then potentially looking forward to next year's cycle for admissions. So I think a lot of people know that this year's cycle, there was a huge uptake in the volume of applications for law schools across the country. So I'm not sure what that's going to look like next year, but what advice would you have for students who are facing a more competitive landscape, either this year or for next year potentially?
Sure. I think one thing that's really important to recognize also, Casey, is that, the students with whom we're speaking and who are going to, watch this, thankfully there was an admission cycle that's already happened, amid this pandemic, amid a really competitive cycle. So in that case, it's really important to be in touch with admissions officers at the schools on your list and get to know their application review processes. Especially during this complicated period, because they may have adopted new policies or have taken different or new perspectives that can help you put your best foot forward. I know in the case that, I've done a little research, especially on behalf of some of my current students, that, they're providing, frequently asked questions on, that are directed toward COVID, that are directed to this same question. So making sure that you can gather that information from those admissions offices to understand how they might be adjusting to this, even understanding what the, taking a look at some of the data of their admissions cycle last year and seeing kind of how competitive in the raw numbers, how competitive it really was. And maybe in many ways that could help inform some of the questions, in the conversations that you have with admissions officers at those schools. But it's really important to address those issues. And some of those, as you might know, that some of those, they can help address some of those questions that might be, I have some pass fail grades on my transcript. What does that mean? How is it going to be reviewed? Losing a job during the pandemic, missing an opportunity to do an internship, especially as things go virtual. What does this mean? How do I let, a school know that this was part of my plan, but I couldn't continue, or I couldn't even begin because of, what's going on this year, that was going on last year, for example, as well. Also, in the case of the LSAT flex scores, versus the traditional LSAT, how is this school, how is that school evaluating them, and really getting down to, a deeper understanding of what they did last year in the last cycle. How did, what does the data look like, and what can they speak to from that experience? As well as financial assistance, recognizing that a request for financial assistance likely might be going up. And so they face some challenges, and I say they, as law schools, face some challenges last year. So they, again, can speak to maybe some new packages, some new adjustments. They can hopefully at least speak with greater empathy and understanding, for sure. But it's also important, I mentioned this early, but to emphasize the importance of, starting the process of researching schools, organizing your application early, and aiming to submit your application early in this cycle. So as a piece of advice, try to submit your application early. In other words, this is, this fall, if you're applying this cycle, so applying this fall before late November. That's generally my rule of thumb. Like, if you can, of course, it might mean that you have to tackle the LSAT earlier too. So, if you can, if it's within your ability, your capacity to do so, try to submit your application early. That means that, that as they're going through a rolling admissions process, you're in that early batch. They also are starting to barely craft their community, their first year class. So by the time that you apply later, which even could be after, if you're in the United States, after Thanksgiving in late November, but certainly after late December, they're already, crafting a class. They've got lots of applications. So the earlier, and I don't want to say the due date, just because it's like, the first applications, even the admissions officers themselves are just getting used to being back in the reading cycle. So I'd say, shoot for that early part of the fall. Again, if you can. The last thing I'll mention in terms of a piece of advice is building your college list. During this unexpected time, this unprecedented, super competitive, these application cycles, making sure that you build a balanced list is really, really important. I had some students this year who, really struggled for a long time. But thankfully I do have, most all of my students got into schools that they wanted to, which is like a deep lesson. But there were moments that were definitely like, I was on the edge of my seat. I was like, oh my gosh, okay. But in the end, it's like, we don't even know where that decision came from. And we're just like, let's not ask, let's just say yes. Like, we don't want to
just celebrate,
how this happened, but let's just celebrate. Obviously they were qualified, but in terms of the competitive numbers, it can be really challenging and really anxiety ridden. So making sure that your list has, certainly, of course, those reach schools that you love, but also those target schools, as well as safety or what can be considered likely admits. So making sure that you have options and that you like all of them. It's one thing to build a balanced list and to hate all of your safety or likely schools. So really make sure, again, that you're building that list thoughtfully, that you're researching the schools and finding reason to love each one. It's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like a key word that I'm hearing through you answering this question is flexibility with this cycle. So would you recommend, or how do you feel about students potentially pushing off a year for law school, or what do you think about students applying for an additional cycle or anything like that? What would you say to students?
So taking off this year, having never applied previously, I would say totally fine. I'd say, just make sure, in that case of taking that year off and not applying, make sure that you make that year rich and full. That's a phrase that I used a lot in admissions, but it's just the general concept of making sure that it's a really enjoyable year. But at the same time, it is full of wonderful experiences and opportunities for you to continue that level of exploration, of achievement, of gaining some qualifications, important skills that can really speak to not only your self-reflection and understanding of yourself and the reason to pursue a law degree, a JD, but in addition to demonstrate, that you are a competitive applicant. So that's what I would recommend for a student who's thinking, I'm not gonna apply this year.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of one last fun question before we kind of wrap up. I love reading. I always love asking people about book recommendations and getting book recommendations. So in general, do you have any book recommendations for prospective law students or people that are interested in pursuing a career in law?
Yeah, for sure. So actually there are a lot of, I know that HLS has book recommendations because that was something that we talked about, and then I heard admissions officers even speaking with prospective students about, yeah, we have a recommended book list, etc. And I'm sure a lot of schools have that as well. So I would, and like you, Casey, I'm also an avid reader. So, but I'm a little bit more of a fiction reader. So I have kind of practical books that I can recommend, but also, if you're a fiction reader, there are some really, really, and more than I will share, really, really incredible fiction books that can be eye-opening for, future lawyers as well. So I know one that has been really valuable to at least one of my students, one of my pre-law students, is Letters to a Young Lawyer by Alan Dershowitz. I think that's passed around pretty often. Also 24 Hours with 24 Lawyers. That's a different kind of approach to a book. So it's more about interviews and anecdotal evidence of with a law experience. That's by Jasper Kim. What can you do with a law degree? The idea that it's not just about, okay, I'm gonna get a JD and go be, a lawyer at a firm. That's what I have to do if I become a lawyer, but really being able to think creatively. What can you do with a law degree? You can do so many things. So I think in many ways, this book, for example, can kind of stretch that initial conception of what a law degree can do. And I think in many ways also can help you recognize, in my personal statement, in my desire to pursue a law degree, I can speak to the importance that it plays in, my love for human rights and my desire to return to, East Asia, to, engage in, grassroots nonprofit work, for example. So it starts to, that book, for example, is really great for students who are not quite sure, for individuals who are not quite sure what they want to do with a law degree, or they might have some ideas, but maybe want to stretch themselves and think creatively. The fiction books that I love.
Yes, we love fiction too. Yeah.
The one that I like, I've read personally, but also has been passed around, I think, amongst a number of, actually some even of my high school students who are not even in college yet, who are already set and getting a law degree. I'll encourage them to read, fiction books, to kind of think creatively and philosophically about what one does with a law degree, or the role, law and the legal system plays in society, etc. But one would be Kafka's The Trial. I think is a really good one. It's a little humorous, but it's definitely a deep thinker, of course. Capote's In Cold Blood. I think is really, really valuable. I read it many years ago, and even at that time, I studied history in college, so I kind of thought about the law path, and that for me, that book was really, really eye-opening. To Kill a Mockingbird is another book that has a of course, a really, really important trial in the midst of its pages. But In Cold Blood, I think, is a really wonderful one in particular. A tougher read, and I am a fan of some Russian literature, but Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I think, is inevitably a classic. You'd have to be willing to sit down for a while, but really speaks to some of the ins and outs and challenges of the legal system, and even some of the philosophical questions that come with justice and the law. So I think those are some of my recommendations. I have to throw in the fiction books.
Yes.
I'm a little bit more of a fiction reader, and they, I think, in many ways can speak to, for a future lawyer, can encourage you to think, beyond kind of the rational aspects of the JD, but really force you to even self-reflect as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for all of them. Yeah, I've been avidly writing them down as you go. So I've read a few of them, but I'm thank you for the book recommendations. And I like nonfiction as well as fiction. So you got to mix it up. You gotta have both on your bookshelf.
And I don't want to forget this one because I just read it. I just saw it recently. I haven't read it yet. But I want to mention it because I remember in the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about, of course, kind of the challenges of the current social environment. We were talking about policing, etc. But this actually, an HLS professor recommended this book, but Policing the Black Man by Angela Davis. So I know it's a little bit more of a specific focus, but it does, I think, in many ways, being able to use, this intersection of law, justice, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic inequity, etc., structural issues, structural corruption, for example, and being able to, even if you're not interested in racial issues, in social justice issues, but being able to look at that intersection of how our society operates and in dealing with, for example, law enforcement and the legal system, especially in this day and age, really important, but also I think can be extrapolated, and be applied to a lot of different types of issues, outside of that single topic.
Yeah, that's, I think, so important. And just to be on a path of continual education, there's always so much to learn. So, and then have you read An American Marriage? Because I'm thinking like that might go along with your book list for fiction, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't yet. I'm not just saying this, but it's actually on my list. I have a book club, and it's on my book club list as an example. And so it's one of those situations where, when you're voting for a book, your vote only gets you so far. But an American Marriage, I would love to read. So, but since you're mentioning it, I'm more inspired for it to be my next book. But yeah, that's a great one to recommend as well.
There's always too many books to read, not enough time. There's always, the list is always expanding. But if you can read that one, that was really eye-opening, and it made me think a lot. So that one's great. But I know we're a little over time, so unless there's any last advice or tips you have for students, but I also want to be respectful of your time. And I'm so appreciative of your time too. This has been really great. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Casey, thank you so much. You've been such a wonderful interviewer. It's been great talking to you. The conversation has been wonderful. Honestly, I don't have any additional advice, outside of what I've said, but, this being a recording, if someone's kind of skipping through, they're looking for those, like just those sound bites that they want to grab, those little sound grabs. I'd say, some of those key components, especially in consideration of, this being so complicated, the last cycle and for cycles to come, the idea of submitting your application early is important. Making sure that you're looking at and analyzing, just as much as you're looking at those schools, you're analyzing also financial aid packaging, and packaging meaning, how much are they offering in regards to loans? What are grant opportunities, or, in terms of packaging, are they giving you, free money in the sense of grants, scholarships, etc., or is it, recommendations for loans? So understanding, and I know there's a level of, financial fluency or at least proficiency in financial aid that's, that is required. So being able to have that conversation early and often is really important. And looking at even outside scholarships or additional scholarships that can make law school affordable. And then the last is really just being in touch with admissions officers, students, alumni. Speaking as, a former admissions officer, like, hopefully I'm not that scary, but like, there are people behind this process. admissions is complicated. It forever has felt like, pulling back this veil, we're called gatekeepers. It can feel very mysterious, but I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that it's a human process. So it is systematic. There are scientific aspects to it, I will admit, but it is also an art. So, being able to have that conversation with admissions officers, meaning that they're going to be the ones reading your application. They're not only experts in this, but they're going to be, on that other side of the desk, on that other side of the ether. When you hit the submit button, it comes to them. So making sure that you feel, that you feel empowered enough to have those conversations with them and to be in touch with students and alumni can be really informative and really helpful.
Those are all fantastic tips. I know I've learned so much from this conversation. I'm sure so many people have learned a lot as they watch this at home later on. So again, thank you so much, Mary. It's been a true pleasure. And I hope that you have a great night, because I think you're it's a little later there.
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock here, but no matter, no issue. Yes, thank you so much, Casey. It was such a pleasure speaking with you, and I wish you the best in your, in your future, in your process. But of course, to any and every student listening who has access, I wish each one of you the best as well. So just believe in yourself. I think you got this.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.